Welcome to our 3:30 Eastern Time afternoon session in Stream 1. Great to have you back with us. And I'm here with two talks this afternoon. Our first one is on building accessible e-learning better for everyone. And Garima is here from Ontario to talk with us, and we're delighted to have her here. So let me go ahead and turn it over to you if you want to go ahead and share your screen and get started at your convenience, and we're all ready to go.
Awesome. Give me one sec. So hello, everybody, and I hope you're enjoying the conference, and thank you for checking out this session. We are going to talk about creating accessible learning, which is engaging, but it's also available to people with different abilities, and how that is better for everyone. And you'll see that it's not even that hard to do. So let's get started. Very quickly, a little about myself. My name is Garima Gupta from Artha Learning, which is a company I founded about 4 years ago, and run very passionately to create wonderful digital learning content with my team here in Toronto, Canada. We've built many accessible and interactive e-learning content. We keep learning, we keep striving to be better at every day. So very happy to share all that with you guys today. So what are we going to do in the session today? What's ahead? A few things. So first of all, we're going to talk about why we are even here. So start with making a case for accessible learning. And you guys are here, clearly you're interested in this. So thank you very much for that. But let's still kind of see how big is that and why do we want to do that? Because it can feel like a lot of work sometimes. And then of course, after that, we'll move on to a general understanding, a lay of land of accessibility laws, guidelines. Do pay attention here, this is important stuff. And then we'll move on to the meat of this session, how to do this. What are the essential, the foundational, the most important things you must consider as you build your learning materials? And then we'll end with resources and Q&A as all good presentations should, right? So let's get on with it. And what I want to do is I want to start with a quote, and you'll see all my section slides have some quotes. I'm going to read this out to you guys because it is simply so amazing. Steve says, "The one argument for accessibility that doesn't get made nearly often enough is how extraordinarily better it makes some people's lives. How many opportunities do we have to dramatically improve people's lives just by doing our jobs a little better?" Wow. And that really changes the perspective, right? From, oh, this is so much work to do, to this is good work to do. This is the right work to do. It is also important to recognize that accessible e-learning makes for a better e-learning for everyone. Just as we would think a ramp in a building with stairs helps, so having a ramp will help not only physically disabled, but also elderly people, kids, people with strollers, shopping carts, so on. So we need to create equitable experiences. We need to take our best work to every user, not just to a subset of them. Not to mention the sheer impact, the sheer number of people our work has the potential to reach. So at this point of time, let me start with a quick poll here to see what do you think that number is. So if we can just launch that poll, the world's population is 8 billion almost. How many do you think suffer with some form of disability? Let's give it a few seconds. Yep, if you can see the results. Are we able to share the results? Interesting. Yes, you know what? It is more than 1 billion, more than 17% actually. And this is old data. This is data from WHO. And here this is, yeah. So this is data from WHO study in 2011, which is like 10 years old. But it still gives us an idea of the staggering number of people you are leaving out if you don't consider accessibility front and center. 1 in every 7 of us is living with some kind of disability, needs some kind of accommodation to live their best lives. So the business case for making learning as accessible is huge, right? And what kind of disabilities are we talking about? And this is important to know because they're generally classified in these 4 categories and the accommodations they need are different. So visual, hearing, motor, and cognitive. And at a very high level, visual disabilities would require usage of special screen reading software. Hearing issues would need text support for your audio multimedia. Someone with motor issues is probably going to use assistive devices to access your content, and your content has to be prepared for that. And cognitive disabilities will require us to reflect on how content itself is presented and probably requires accommodation at an individual's level. Now, something else to keep in mind, and I'm going to be very brief here, but a visually impaired person naturally could be a blind person, but it could also be someone with a poor eyesight who forgot their glasses at home, right? Me many times, or someone who is colorblind. So if we design a course that works for people with visual impairments, we contribute towards building a better world for many more. Another example, a video with transcriptions. It helps your deaf learners, but it also helps non-native speakers. So accessible design is good design for everyone. It's better for everyone. If you can think of other examples where an accessible design is helpful to others, I'd love to see them in chat. Please do write. Now, moving on, there are laws around it. But as we work towards implementing those laws, learning those laws, it is important to remember who we are serving, who we're doing this. So as an inspiration, here is a quote from Christopher Reeve, right? Amazing people who've achieved a lot despite their challenges. It's important that we remember that we're doing it for them. We remember the human potential, the human angle, the humans for which these laws are made. Because when you just see the laws and the guidelines, kind of that sometimes get hidden, right? And that's important for us to remember. Okay, so talking about the guiding principles. Accessible digital content is now law in most places, depending on where you live, where your training is being delivered, where your learners are, the laws can differ. It's an alphabet soup for sure. In US itself, ADA is a civil rights law. Section 508 is a similar required, but for federal agencies. In Toronto, Ontario, where I live, we have AODA, right? And plenty of similar laws all over the world. However, for most practical purposes, all you need to know, thankfully, are the WCAG or WCAG guidelines. WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's an ISO standard, it's curated by the World Web Consortium, and most laws kind of refer back to it, right? And there are 3 levels, A, AA, AAA, and I'll get to them in just a bit. But before we do that, and before we go deep into what law requires what, it's important to look at the principles of building. We nowadays call it WCAG, just short form. Building WCAG accessible content, right? There are 4 principles, POUR, 4. So P is for perceivable. So your content needs to be perceivable. Users must be able to comprehend the information being depicted. It can't be invisible. Like that's the most basic thing. If I am deaf and you are playing audio, I can't hear you, the audio. The learning content will not make sense to me. So I should be able to comprehend the information, most fundamental, right? The second one is operable. The course should not require interaction that a user cannot perform. So, the AR, VR, and scenarios and drag and drops and all these things they have their own place, but we need to make sure that it is accessible, the interactivity is accessible, everybody is able to handle the interactivity, work with it. The third principle is understandable, non-cryptic, easily understandable, organized in predictable, sensible ways, right? And lastly, robust. So technologies evolve, the content should remain accessible. And this principle is mostly taken care of by the user agents and that technology itself. So for example, if my content is accessible via keyboard, it will usually be by other agents as well, like eye tracking software. This is great stuff. POUR, the principles of WCAG accessible content. But you know what? It's kind of vague. It's kind of really wide because, okay, I create something. If it's perceivable to me, how do I know that it's really, accessible? It's perceivable to everybody. So that is further clarified in the compliance level, A, AA, and AAA. So level A is a must-have. If your content is not level A accessible, your design has serious issues, even for regular user. People will have difficulty navigating, understanding, and using your content, right? AA is a should have. That's the level that's most usually legally required for our work. And that is, the level at which most learners can access your course. And AAA conformance, now that level tends to be pretty specialist content. The criteria are really strict. Let's take an example. Color, for example, right? At AA, the only requirement is that you don't use only color to indicate something of importance. You use some other visual indicator as well. When you come to AA, now there are color contrast ratios and you have to adhere to them. In AAA, these ratios become super stringent. So practically you could have no color text, everything's black and white, right? So there are detailed requirements, and if you were into this field, you could go in and kind of find out everything. But today, what I'm going to do is just kind of cover them at a high level. One last thing for my friends in educational settings, which is a main audience here. And we talk a lot about universal design for learning, right? It's an important thing. How does that work with accessibility? So very briefly here, they both seek to increase learner access. Clearly, they want to reduce barriers for students' grade. Now, UDL aims for a broad range of learners, whereas digital accessibility focuses on learners who have particular needs related to sensory, physical, or cognitive impairment, right? So sometimes focusing on both can feel overwhelming, but really accessible content kind of reduces many barriers. So you've seen this image, I suppose, a lot of times. This is overused sometimes to talk about equality and equity. But what accessibility does is kind of changes that fence to a wire fence. And so sometimes you wouldn't even need those extra ways of providing your content. Okay, with all this information with us, let's make our training accessible, right? So I'm going to talk about very bedrock, very foundational elements that go into whether interactive or non-interactive learning. And let's get us inspiration from Stella Young and make a broader, more accessible environment for everyone. So this is the fun part of the presentation. I'm going to come up with some examples of how content can be made accessible. And these examples are from courses that we've developed. So you'll see a little bit of that. Let's start with color. Now, WCAG level A guideline says don't use only color to indicate information. So in this slide from one of our courses, you could see there are 4 sections. Now, the only way for the learner to know which is the active or the hover state of the section was this color change. Now, this would fail. This is not accessible. If I was colorblind and I couldn't see that section 3 is highlighted, I wouldn't know that, right? So what we did is we basically changed that a little bit and we added a write-up down there. So what that does is now, even if I was colorblind, I would know that. Or people would sometimes add textures. Now, this happens a lot. Imagine visited states in tabbed interactions, in responses. A shape can turn red or green to inform learners of feedback. Now, that's not enough. You have to have either a check mark or a cross mark, some other visual indicator there, because only color difference, not good enough, right? So that's one of the important things. Second thing is about the color contrast. So we need to make sure that the color contrast at the AA level is 4.5:1 for normal text and 3:1 for large text. So for example, if you put a dark gray on light gray, people are not going to be able to make out. So there has to be that contrast between background and foreground. Now, I have a funny story around it, actually. Very recently, we were updating our website. So this is how our website looked. And white on yellow, we loved it. It looked stylish. It looked fresh. The team loved it. But it failed the color contrast test. So we had to change it to black on yellow. Now, some of us are not as crazy about this combination, but at least all the visitors can now read our story, right? And that is important to us. Let me show you the 2 tests. So this one, and you can see this is white text on yellow background, the initial one, and the contrast ratio is 1.93:1. So it fails both AA and AAA. Now, black on yellow, significantly better and passes all the tests. So yeah, so then we decided whether we like it or not, we got to go with black on yellow. So those are the kind of minor things that you need to do in order to make sure everybody who visits your learning materials can read them. It's not only about style, right? Sometimes what happens here is, how this black on yellow, people would look at the main button state and it is good, the default state is good, great. But if there are like other states like hover or something, then it might not work. So you need to make sure that all the states, hyperlinks, all of that works. One final thing on color. If you're using like a background, in this case, it was a video of Niagara Falls because we were talking about we were creating this module for a government agency in Ontario. So what you want to do is kind of check whether you have gradients as background or whatever. Some areas will have sufficient contrast, some will not. So check where you think there will be lowest contrast. If that passes, you're good to go, right? So that's about color. Now, another big deal is if you're using media, right, make sure that it is supported by text. So that's alternate text. All the images, all the videos should have, the images should have all alternate text to them. Now, standard principle and guideline is all the images that contain information, right? So you don't want to do that for decorative images, but because you don't want to create information overload. Pretty simple, right? Well, not necessarily. So for example, this is our taxation module that we did for a nonprofit. And you can see like, it's talking about taxation, but there is this Finnish base flag. Would you say that it needs alt text? Think about it. Would this flag need alternate text? Probably not, right? And you'd be right. It's a taxation module, so this is a decorative image. However, this was actually a gamified module, and it was built in a gamified way. And so you will see that it carries that analogy of racetrack throughout the course. And we talk about racetracks and lap 1 and lap 2 and checkpoint. And here you can see start your engines. These things won't make full sense if some of the early images are not explained. So think about your course in totality, in fullness, and then think about, do my images need alt text? For somebody who can't see that, this information people can get visually. If I can't see it visually, I won't get that information or that analogy or that context, right? So be very careful and put alt text where you must. Similarly, another thing to be careful about with alt text or alternate text. If you're using graphics or infographics in your course, think about what information people are getting from it when they look at it. And how can you convey that same information in an alternate text? Now, sometimes that might mean that your alt text is very descriptive, but it's important. So, for example, this is our alt text, and it is quite in detail, but I would say err on the side of caution, put more, explain in detail, because people who can't see this infographic visually will not get that information. And finally, in this supporting media with text, definitely about transcripts and closed captions. Many times people will ask me when to go for transcripts, when to go for closed captions. It really depends on what you have on the screen. Is that synchronized? Does it make sense when people read it in connection with what's on screen? Whether it has to be seen in conjunction, so those kind of things. But transcript is always a plus. In all our courses, if there is audio, we'll always put transcript. Helps non-native learners as well. Okay, I'm keeping an eye on the time, and we're about 10 minutes out, so I'm going to be a little quick because we do have quite a few interesting things. Here, for example, using hyperlinks or language considerations, right? Mind your language. If I am a visual impaired person and I'm using screen reader, I could jump from links to links using my screen reading software. And the screen reading software is going to name the hyperlink, right? Since click here to find about here. And that doesn't tell me anything. So what you want to do is, that's my Slack notification. We want to make sure that our hyperlinks are descriptive. So can you think about how else should we be writing it? here is my suggestion. Select information about City of Toronto to know more, right? So now the screen reader software, instead of saying hyperlink, here it was a hyperlink, information about City of Toronto. And that's way better because now if I'm using that assistive technology, I know what this link is about. It's good practice. You also see that instead of click, I'm now saying select, because selection can be done in many ways. You can click, but you can also tap. You can also select enter. You could use eye tracking software. There are different ways of select. Sometimes people say, let's see. Your user might not be seeing it. So instead of saying, let's see, we want to say something like, consider this, right? And that is probably a good idea. So those kind of things. And finally, make sure that your course is accessible via a keyboard. So people could use the tab key and they could use the space key, and they are for two different groups, right? People with motor issues. So if I can't use a mouse, I can't use a drag and drop interaction unless it has a different way of kind of doing that, right? So that's kind of important. If I am a visually impaired person, again, then I'm not using what's on the screen, I'm using other assistive technology. So make sure that the content that you're creating, people can reach it and people can do all the interactions that they need to do through a keyboard. And if they can do it through keyboard, they can do it through other robust technologies as well. So that's kind of what. I know it sounds like a lot of work, but it is all worth it. And I'm going to end this with this quote from Stephen Hawking. However difficult life may seem, there is always something you can do and succeed at. And as learning developers and designers, we can do and we can succeed at creating courses that help everybody be better at what they do, right? And as I promised, there is definitely a resource hub for you to look at. What we've done, because it's close to our heart, we've created a resource page. It's called Better for Everyone at arcalearning.com. And you'll find their Padlets for learning more. And those Padlets are, if you have a good idea, you could go and edit those as well. It's crowdsourcing tools. There is a recording of a similar kind of session. You can find a slide deck there. So, I mean, there are some great links there, some great resources. But if you have something that we haven't thought about, please let me know and add it to the Padlet. It's crowdsourced, and we always share this with people. So it's a pretty well-maintained resource. That's it from me. Thank you very much. And if there are any questions, I can take them now.
All right, well, fantastic. That's a lot of information, a lot of really, really useful information for, I think, our entire audience. So there are a few minutes for questions if people have anything to ask and anything to follow up on. And while we're waiting for those, one question I was kind of curious about, you mentioned early on one of the examples was the graphics that weren't meeting the right contrast ratio, right? Like for your website.
Yep.
When you work with a graphic artist, are there things that you now do to try to make sure it's going to be accessible, but also make sure it's something that you're going to like, right? So that you're not correcting it later in the process, but so from the beginning, you're going for accessibility, and it's clear that that's a goal.
Absolutely, and that's such a great thing to add here, David. Is don't do accessibility as an afterthought. Then it does feel like a lot of work. Start with that in mind. It's so much easier if you're, let's say you're using PowerPoint, right? If your slide masters are accessible, then everything that you create is. If your color palette is accessible, then everything else you create would be. So start with that in mind. So what we do, for example, when we start on a e-learning design project, we create a visual guide that makes sure that everything that follows would be accessible. Absolutely.
Great. That's great. And within PowerPoint itself, you're saying to make PowerPoint accessible. What things, the color palette, certainly, what are the other things that you need to make sure of, just to sort of sum those up?
Yeah, for example, the tabbing order is one thing that always comes up, especially in e-learning. If you're using software like iSpring or Storyline to kind of build off of PowerPoint, then that's important. Alt text is an important thing for people who are not, who are depending on that information to kind of read through your content. Alt text is great for SEO as well. So it's anyways a great idea to do.
Great.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think, man. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to add that language. Make sure that the language is accessible.
Makes sense. That's great. I'm trying to think that anything else. We have just another minute or so if there are additional questions. And if not, we can wrap up in just a second. So yeah, if you want to, I think I'm sharing now. If you want to put the resources link in the chat as well, maybe for people just to make sure that they have it, because I think that's a really valuable link. I want to make sure everybody has that. You have that link on your final slide with the resources, if you're able to do that. I feel like that might be a great place for everyone to go, where in one place you kind of just get a list of all the things that you need to design for and design accessibly, and that's make sure nothing gets lost. All right.
And it does have a recording of this kind of session. It does have a slide deck because we do this in a number of places. And we do want to make sure that everybody building e-learning should think about accessible design every day.
Yeah, no, there's no question. I guess one final question regarding that. Do you run into, I think you work with, with outside clients. Do you run into discussions with clients about budgets, about anything where that's, where that's sort of at issue? Or is the goal simply like put your processes in place so it's baked into the processes and then it's just a nobody could argue against it, I guess I'm saying, for budget reasons?
Yeah, well, we find it the other way around, where the clients actually do ask for it. Now that it's law in more places, that it's something that people do need to make sure that they have on their side. And our processes are definitely in place. So that kind of gives them that comfort that everything all that their digital media is going to be accessible. So people ask for it. They're very, very aware of accessibility requirements. And that's a beautiful thing to see.
Okay. No, that's great to see. That's great to see. It may be a little more true in Canada than in the US, but we can say that for another time. Wonderful. I think on that note, we can wrap up. So with this talk, Garima, it was great to have you here, and something so valuable, and I really appreciate the resources as well for everyone, and I think we'll all take advantage of them. So thanks once again.
Thank you. Great to be here. Enjoy your conference, everyone.